Stu, I'd be back with another story. And I am. Now, tonight's tale is dedicated to everyone who has that special pet in their life, and, well, you're mine, my darling parakeet. Without you, I would be so horribly lonely. Now, without further ado, let's get into the nightmare, shall we? Prepare yourself for That Neighbor Dog, written by Sean M. Davis. And now this story will be read to you as it first appeared in Bête Noire. Get ready. It was after 4 days of nearly continuous barking. Yapping, really. The dog's bark out of proportion with its size, by the shit brown mutt tied to its doghouse outside that one of the neighbors, Paul Murray, had decided he had had enough. "Are you going to call the cops?" his wife Anne asked when he finally threw down the newspaper, muttering. "No," Paul said, throwing his jacket around his shoulders. "I'm going to tell that jackass that he can go to hell and take his goddamn dog with him." Paul knew that he wouldn't say any such thing when it came down to the moment, and so did his wife. After all, he was usually soft-spoken and just wanted everyone to get along. As Paul walked up his neighbor's driveway to the walkway that branched out and crossed in front of the house to its porch, the dog's barking deepened, intoned a response to his approach. At the gate, before turning onto the walkway, he saw into the backyard, the dog up on its hind legs, barking and snapping in the air. The chrome dish, full of food or water at some point, now overturned, a few scattered sticks nearby. Paul's annoyance focused a little more on the people inside the house. It had seemed like 4 continuous days. But Paul went to work every day, so he didn't know for sure. But seeing that overturned dish, he wondered, when was the last time the dog had been fed, given water, allowed inside? His annoyance felt justified, and in that moment, he thought he really could tell the people in the house that there were no bad dogs, only bad owners, and that they could go to hell. He knocked on the door, knocked again, louder, pounded on the door so hard that his hand hurt and he needed to stop after a minute or so. And the dog kept on barking in the backyard. Come to think of it, Paul thought as he took a step back and tried to peer through the living room curtains, which were pulled shut, I don't think I've seen anyone coming or going the last couple of days. After another minute of knocking brought no one to the door, Paul went home and shared his wonderings with his wife. "You know," Anne said, then paused, "I think you're right. I mean, I haven't been watching the house like a hawk or anything, you know. But, you've always kind of aware of your neighbors. And, like, when they leave for work and come home and stuff like that. And I don't think I've seen either of them for a couple days now." Paul nodded, his mind processing what he knew, what his wife had just told him, and what he was beginning to suspect with a sinking feeling in his stomach. He pulled his cell phone from his back pocket. "I think I'll call the police now," he said, dialing. When the line was picked up, he said, "Hello, my name is Paul Murray, and I think my neighbors have left and abandoned their dog. Yes, it's tied up in the backyard." Paul gave the police the necessary information and was assured that someone would be right over. It had happened before, they explained. A house that's about to be foreclosed on. The family finds an apartment before the foreclosure shows up on their credit report. leaves behind pets that their new apartments won't take, usually with some food and water. When the foreclosure goes through and the people from the bank come, they get a little four-legged bonus. Newly updated colonial, finished basement, dog already installed on the property. Paul thanked him and hung up the phone. A slow day for Lincoln Park PD. A cruiser turned onto the block 28 minutes later and rolled down the street, its lights off, drawing little notice. The patrolman inside, John Porter, was a first year, and this was his first solo ride. His instructions were clear. Check the premises, ascertain if the people had left or not, the furniture would probably be gone, and report back. Simple. In 3 days, Porter would quit. But for now, he was fresh-faced and chatted with Paul, who had come out to meet him in front of the house, the dog still barking. "Geez, 4 days, huh?" the detective asked. Paul nodded. "You'd think it'd lose its voice or something. By the end of 4 days, I probably couldn't speak if I was hollering all the time." Paul nodded and made to follow him when Porter started up the walkway. "Look, stay here, huh? Either they're here and I talk to them, or they're not, and I can't have you around anyway. Liability, you know." Paul nodded again, his face grave. Looking at his house, he waved at Anne, who stood in their living room window, holding aside the curtains. Porter peered into the window, cupping his hands around his face. Even though it was getting dark and there was no glare, there was a light on in the back of the house, and the curtains were just translucent enough that he could see that no one was in the living room. He rang the doorbell, knocked on the door, expecting no answer and getting none. He stepped back to walk around to the gate and check out the dog's situation, when his hand grasped the doorknob and turned it. Porter snatched his hand back, as if the knob was hot, surprised that it had opened. The door stood open an inch, and he toed it open another few inches. Back on the sidewalk, Paul was rubbernecking, trying to see around the young patrolman. Porter looked back, almost as if he wanted Paul to tell him what he should do. Then he remembered that he was a policeman, and he pressed the button on his walkie-talkie. "The door is unlocked. I am announcing my presence and going inside." Porter pushed the door the rest of the way open, feeling that childish feeling that was so hard to get over, even now when he was a police officer. That feeling that he was somewhere he shouldn't be, doing something he shouldn't be doing. "My name is John Porter," he announced to the house. "I'm a police officer. Your door was unlocked and I'm coming in." Paul watched the patrolman enter the house, waited, looked at his house again, but Anne wasn't standing in the window anymore. When questioned later, Paul would say that he wasn't sure how long after Patrolman Porter went into the house that he heard the scream. 1 minute, maybe 2, definitely no more than 5. It was exactly 1 minute and 39 seconds after Porter had gone into the house that Paul had heard him scream. Forgetting his warning about liability, knowing only that someone was in trouble, Paul leapt forward. Running up onto the porch, he was knocked aside by Porter, who burst through the open door, ran straight off the porch, and collapsed into a shrieking, puking mess on the front lawn. Paul looked into the house, at a living room still furnished with neat cream-colored furniture, unlit lamps, and a modest-sized TV, and then at the patrolman. who finished throwing up, continued screaming, covered his eyes. Then, horrified at what he saw in the darkness behind his lids, moved his hands to tear at his hair. Porter met Paul's eyes, and tears streaming down his face, snot running from his nose, shrieked so loud that his voice cracked and faded into a gurgle. Then the man passed out. The world had been stunned into silence, stilled by Porter's screaming. But then the dog started barking again. That broke Paul's paralysis, and he whipped his cell phone out of his pocket to dial 911. Then he went to Porter, found that he was unconscious but breathing, and gave the open door another long look, and decided that he really didn't want to know. The arrival of an ambulance and another police car, sirens on, lights blazing, brought more neighbors out of their homes into the chilly October evening. The paramedics rushed to Porter, still passed out in blissful oblivion, and the cops, older than Porter and more experienced, pulled Paul away to question him. On hearing what had happened, the pair exchanged looks and walked up to the house and inside, hands on their pistols. Less than a minute later, they came out, faces pallid, lips drawn tight. One of them, a man with a graying mustache, beckoned to the paramedics, who were satisfied that Porter had only passed out from shock and would be fine. The other officer, the younger looking of the pair, walked to their cruiser at a forced, calm pace and radioed dispatch about the situation. Paul didn't hear what the mustached officer said to the paramedics, but in response to a question, heard him say, "I don't know. 2 for sure, but the number of arms and legs is wrong." Paul decided he'd heard enough and tried to sneak away, but the younger-looking officer caught him and made him tell his story again, going back over every detail. Paul heard the second ambulance before seeing it. The 2 newly arrived paramedics took charge of the passed-out patrolman, while the other 2 went back to their ambulance and returned with 2 stretchers, with 2 empty black bags like stomachs waiting to be filled. Paul gurped and needed to ask the younger-looking officer to repeat the question. Over the next few weeks of the investigation, the police interviewed everyone on the block. Paul especially needed to repeat his story many times until he was sure that he'd never forget it. Walter Hasbrook and his father Irving left their dog outside for long hours to bark, which annoyed pretty much everyone in the neighborhood. But the barking dog wasn't enough reason to kill the 2 men and dismember their bodies. The missing arm and leg were found outside with the dog, which had stripped the flesh and licked the bones clean. No one else in the neighborhood was questioned. Bill Butler watched from his back window all that night, across his backyard, which abutted the Hasbrooks. Among all the people coming and going, the dog kept barking, and Bill's left eye twitched with every bark. 2 days later, Bill happened to be at his kitchen sink, washing dishes, when movement from his neighbor's backyard caught his eye. A woman and a man were opening the Hasbrooks. Not the Hasbrooks anymore. Gate. The woman had her hands raised and her lips were moving, as if trying to reason with the mongrel. The dog was, of course, barking, standing on its hind legs, boxing the air with its front paws. Bill gripped the edge of the sink and ground his teeth. At last, the woman let her arms flop to her sides and nodded at the man, who cocked a gun. Bill's eyes widened, and he shouted at the man, unheard through the window and across the 2 yards. But instead of a crash of exploding gunpowder, Bill didn't hear anything. The dog just flumped down, and the woman took a cautious step forward. Again, she nodded at the man, who fit a muzzle around the dog's head and picked it up, putting it gently into a crate, which he wheeled away. "Finally," Bill muttered. He hoped the dog would find a good home. After all, there were no bad dogs, only bad owners. Bill submerged a large butcher's knife in the still, hot, sudsy water, using a brush to scrub its razor edge. Oh, how delightful. I think that's a dear, dear story that any pet owner could love. Now, don't worry. There's plenty more from this writer. You can find all kinds of ghastly tales at seanmdavis.wordpress.com. Now, remember, my little darlings, the ghouls say like and subscribe. I still don't know what that means, but it sounds delightful. Now, good night.